The first thing you noticed about Old Man Hemlock, Arthur Hemlock, technically, though few in the village used his first name anymore, was his shadow. Not the literal kind cast by the afternoon sun, but a four-legged, perpetually hopeful shadow with soft brown eyes and a tail that thumped a gentle rhythm against the worn floorboards of his small cottage. This shadow had a name, Buster. Buster wasn't a dog of distinguished lineage. He was a rescue, a scruffy terrier mix with ears that could unquite decide if they wanted to stand up or flop over, and a coat the color of muddy puddles and autumn leaves. Arthur had found him shivering in a cardboard box outside the local grocery store 5 years prior, abandoned and bewildered. Arthur, himself a widower whose own shadow had lengthened considerably since his wife Martha passed, hadn't been looking for a dog, but one look into those frightened, intelligent eyes, and a silent understanding passed between them. Loneliness recognized loneliness. From that day forward, Arthur and Buster were inseparable. Their lives settled into a comfortable, quiet routine dictated by the rising sun, the chime of the grandfather clock in the hall, and Buster's internal timetable for walks and meals. Mornings began with Buster nudging Arthur awake with a wet nose, followed by a slow amble down the lane, Arthur leaning heavily on his cane, Buster trotting patiently beside him, occasionally darting off to investigate an interesting smell but always circling back, his eyes fixed on his human. Afternoons were for naps in matching worn armchairs by the fireplace, Arthur dozing over his newspaper, Buster curled at his feet, twitching and softly woofing in his dreams. Evenings involved shared suppers and watching old black-and-white movies on the television, Buster's head resting companionably on Arthur's knee. At night, Buster slept on a braided rug beside Arthur's bed, a furry, breathing anchor in the quiet darkness. Buster wasn't just a pet. He was Arthur's confidant, his furry alarm clock, his foot warmer, his reason to get up in the morning when the silence of the house felt too heavy. Arthur talked to Buster constantly, narrating his day, sharing memories of Martha, complaining about the weather. Buster would listen intently, head cocked, offering a comforting lick to Arthur's hand or a sympathetic sigh, as if understanding every word. He was fluent in the language of the heart, if not in English. Their peaceful existence continued unchanged for years, a gentle rhythm of mutual companionship, but time, as it does, began to catch up with Arthur. His steps grew slower, his breathing more labored. The walks down the lane became shorter, punctuated by more frequent rests on the old wooden bench under the oak tree. Buster seemed to sense the change. He stayed closer than ever, matching Arthur's slow pace without complaint, his usual energetic bursts replaced by a quiet, watchful presence. He'd nudge Arthur's hand gently if the old man paused too long, a silent inquiry. "Are you all right?" Then came the cough, a persistent, rattling sound that settled deep in Arthur's chest. Doctor visits followed, hushed conversations, and finally, a diagnosis that hung heavy in the air of the small cottage: advanced pulmonary fibrosis. There was no cure, only management, a slow, inevitable decline. Arthur, pragmatic and stoic, accepted the news with quiet resignation. His biggest worry, voiced softly to the visiting nurse, wasn't for himself, but for his shadow. What will happen to Buster? As Arthur's condition worsened, his world shrank to the confines of the cottage. The walks stopped altogether. Getting out of his armchair became a monumental effort. Buster adapted, his loyalty unwavering, his world shrinking alongside Arthur's. He rarely left Arthur's side. foregoing his usual explorations of the garden unless gently coaxed out by a neighbor who came to check in. He'd lie for hours with his head resting on the arm of Arthur's chair, or later, beside his bed, when Arthur became too weak to move easily. He became an intuitive nurse. He learned the sound of Arthur's labored breathing and would whine softly, nudging him awake if it seemed too shallow. He'd fetch his leash and drop it near the door, not necessarily demanding a walk, but perhaps reminding Arthur of the world outside, of happier times. When Arthur struggled to eat, Buster would sit patiently, refusing his own food until Arthur had managed a few bites. His brown eyes, usually bright and alert, took on a perpetually worried expression. Neighbors offered to take Buster, to give him more exercise, a break from the heavy atmosphere of the sick room. "He needs a proper run, Arthur," kind Mrs. Gable from next door would say. "He won't go," Arthur would rasp, managing a weak smile as Buster pressed closer, licking his hand. "He knows where he belongs." And he did. Buster's place was steadfastly, stubbornly, beside the man who had rescued him, the man who was now his entire world. He seemed to understand, on a level deeper than human comprehension, that his presence was Arthur's greatest comfort. He absorbed the sadness in the cottage, reflecting it in his own quiet demeanor, yet always offering that steady, grounding presence. The final weeks were difficult. Arthur drifted in and out of lucidity. Sometimes he'd murmur Martha's name. Other times he'd reach out a trembling hand, searching for the familiar feel of fur. Buster was always there, allowing his ears to be gently stroked, resting his muzzle on the bed covers. A warm, living connection to the world Arthur was slowly leaving. He rarely barked, rarely made a sound beyond soft whimpers or contented sighs when Arthur managed a moment of gentle affection. He was a silent, furry vigil keeper. One quiet Tuesday morning, as the first rays of sun slanted through the window pane, Arthur Hemlock drew his last, peaceful breath. He passed quietly in his sleep, his hand resting near the edge of the bed, inches from where Buster lay curled. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of shared companionship. It was the profound, absolute stillness of absence. Buster, sensing the change immediately, stirred. He nudged Arthur's still hand with his nose. No response. He whined softly, a questioning sound. He nudged again, more insistently this time. He licked the cool skin, expecting the familiar pat, the mumbled greeting. Nothing. He jumped onto the bed, something he rarely did unless invited, pacing anxiously near Arthur's head, whining louder now, a sound of confusion and dawning distress. He licked Arthur's face, his tail tucked low, his body trembling slightly. He couldn't understand why his human wouldn't wake up, why the familiar scent was changing, why the comforting rhythm of breath had ceased. When the visiting nurse arrived later that morning for her routine check-in, she found Buster lying protectively across Arthur's chest, refusing to move, a low growl rumbling in his throat as she approached. It wasn't aggression. It was grief manifested as guardianship. He was guarding his master, even in death. It took gentle coaxing, patience, and the familiar voice of Mrs. Gable, whom the nurse had called, to finally persuade Buster to move. Even then, he refused to leave the room, settling back onto his rug beside the bed, his eyes fixed on Arthur's still form, emitting heart-wrenching whimpers. The days that followed were a blur of hushed activity. The undertaker, concerned neighbors, the clearing of the cottage. Through it all, Buster remained a figure of profound, unwavering loyalty. He refused food offered by kind hands, drank little water, He wouldn't leave the cottage willingly. When Mrs. Gable finally managed to lead him out on his leash, he pulled constantly towards the familiar path down the lane, then back towards the empty house, confused why Arthur wasn't with them. He'd spend hours lying by the front door, waiting, his ears perked at every distant sound, hoping for the familiar shuffle of Arthur's feet, the rattle of his keys. He'd sniff Arthur's empty armchair, circling it before settling down with a heavy sigh, burying his nose in the worn fabric that still held the faint scent of his beloved human. Mrs. Gable, her own heart aching for the old man and his devoted companion, took Buster into her own home. Her house was warm, her intentions kind. She had other pets, a cheerful garden, everything a dog could seemingly want. But Buster remained inconsolable. He ate mechanically, without joy. He tolerated the pats and cuddles of Mrs. Gable's grandchildren, but offered little affection in return. His spark was gone, extinguished by the loss of his anchor. His loyalty to Arthur transcended life itself. Every afternoon, around the time he and Arthur used to take their walk, Buster would go to Mrs. Gable's front gate, staring intently down the road towards the village cemetery, which lay just beyond the bend. He knew, somehow, where Arthur had been taken. One afternoon, the gate was accidentally left unlatched. Buster slipped out. Mrs. Gable found him hours later, not running wild or chasing squirrels, but lying patiently on the grass beside Arthur Hemlock's freshly marked grave. He had found his way there, drawn by an instinct, a bond that death itself could not sever. He wasn't digging or distressed. He was simply waiting, keeping his vigil, being Arthur's shadow. Even now, Mrs. Gable had tears streaming down her face as she gently clipped the leash back onto his collar. "Oh, Buster," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "He's not coming back, my boy." Buster looked up at her, his brown eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. Then he looked back at the grave marker, let out a soft sigh, and allowed himself to be led away. But Mrs. Gable understood. This wasn't just a dog missing his owner. This was a display of loyalty so pure, so profound, it defied explanation. From that day on, Mrs. Gable made sure the gate was always latched. But she also started taking Buster to the cemetery for short visits. He would lie quietly by the grave, seemingly content just to be near, before allowing himself to be led home again. Buster never truly got over losing Arthur. A part of his heart remained buried in that quiet churchyard. But slowly, nurtured by Mrs. Gable's unwavering kindness and patience, he began to show flickers of his old self. A hesitant tail wag when she came home, a gentle nuzzle against her hand. He learned to accept comfort again, to find solace in a new routine. He even started playing tentatively with Mrs. Gable's other dog. He lived out his remaining years in quiet comfort, cherished and understood. But anyone who truly knew him, who saw the lingering sadness in his gentle eyes, knew that his heart belonged eternally to Old Man Hemlock. Buster's story became a local legend, whispered with reverence, and often accompanied by a shared tissue. It was a stark, beautiful, heart-wrenching reminder that loyalty, in its purest form, knows no bounds, not even the finality of death. It was, as anyone who heard it would attest, the most moving story of loyalty they had ever seen.